वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। आज के वीडियो में हम बात करेंगे पीबी शैली और उनके वर्क डिफेंस ऑफ पोएट्री के बारे में। चलिए शुरू करते हैं आज की वीडियो। डिस्कस करते पहले पीबी शैली के बारे में। द लाइफ एंड वर्क्स ऑफ Percy Bysshe Shelley exemplify English romanticism in both its extremes of joyous ecstasy and brooding despair. Romanticism's major themes, restlessness and brooding rebellion against authority, interchange with nature, the power of the visionary imagination and of poetry, the pursuit of idle love, and the untamed spirit, even in search of poetry, the pursuit of idle love, and the untamed spirit, even in search of freedom. All of these Shelley exemplified in the way he lived his life and lived on the substantial body of work that he left the world after his legendary death by drowning at age 29. From the beginning of his writing career at the age of 17, throughout his life and even to the present day, the very name of Shelley has evoked either the strongest vehemence or the warmest praise bordering on worship. More than any other English romantic writer, with the possible exception of his friend George Gordon, Lord Byron, Shelley's life and reputation have had a history and life of their own apart from the reputation of his various works, and one that continued to evolve even after his death from drowning at the age of 29. Born on 4th August 1792, the year of the terror in France, B.B. Shelley was the son of Timothy and Elizabeth Shelley as the elder son among one brother John and four sisters Shelley. Four sisters Elizabeth, Mary, Margaret, and Helen. Percy stood in line not only to inherit his grandfather's considerable estate but also to sit in Parliament one day. In his position as oldest male child, young Percy was beloved and admired by his sisters, his parents, and even the servants in his early reign as young Lord of Field Place, the family home near Horsham, Sussex. Playful and imaginative, he devised games to play with his sisters and told ghost stories to an enrapt and willing to be thrilled audience. However, the idyllic and receptive world of Field Place did not prepare him for the regimented discipline and taunting boys of Surrey House Academy, which Shelley entered in 1802. Here, Shelley was subjected to the usual bullying, made all worse by his failure to control his temper and his poor skills in fighting. The most positive memories Shelley had of his 2 years at Surrey House were undoubtedly of the imaginative and lively lectures of Adam Walker on science, electricity, and astronomy and chemistry, an interest which Shelley retained throughout his life. In Shelley's free-ranging mind, there was no contradiction between an interest in science and an appetite for trashy Gothic romance thrillers such as Matthew Gregory's Lewis' popular The Monk, 1795. Shelley's 6 years at Eton College, which he entered at the age of 12 in 1804, are more notable for his early love interest and his early literary endeavors than for what he learned in a formal curriculum. Shelley was often bullied and taunted with epithets such as Mad Shelley and Shelley the Atheist, a situation elevated sometimes by the intervention of his older cousin Tom Edwin, who was later to become one of Shelley's first biographies. The strongest adult influence on Shelley during this time was not one of his masters but Dr. James Lind, the physician to the royal household at nearby Windsor, whom Shelley admired for his knowledge and free spirits and idolized as a kind of substitute father figure. As Newman Ivy White notes, Dr. Lind was the prototype of the benevolent old man who free loan from prison in the revolt of Islam. Shelley's access to Dr. Lind's extensive library enabled him to pursue his earlier interests in science and magic as well as to begin a wide range of reading in philosophy and literature. By the end of his career at Eton, he was reading widely in Plato, Pliny, and Lucretius, reading Robert Southey enthusiastically and Lord Walter Scott less so as well, continuing to read many Gothic romances. Shelley's ideas embodied in his verse, his prose, and his life remain as a challenge to the servile acceptance of authority and as a challenge to us to achieve our highest potential, to always aspire to higher goals for ourselves and or for society. of poetry के बारे में जानते हैं. A Defense of Poetry is an essay written by Romantic poet P.B. Shelley, one of the most important prose works of the Romantic era and a valuable document concerning Shelley's own poetic approach. Shelley wrote A Defense of Poetry in 1821 in response to an essay written by his friend Thomas Love Peacock. In the Four Ages of Poetry, Peacock, now best remembered for novels like Nightmare Abbey, bitterly argued that poetry was surplus to requirements in the modern age because scientific and technological discoveries had rendered it unnecessary. We can get all the wonder we need from science, arguing from a utilitarian position. Peacock, with his tongue, if not firmly in his check, then certainly languidly resting against it, suggests that poetry is of less use to modern men than it was in the previous ages. Shelley intended his essay to be published in the follow-up issue of the Literary Miscellany, which had published Peacock's essay that had promptly Shelley revolt. However, the miscellany folded after its first issue, so Shelley's essay was never printed and it only appeared in print in 1840, 18 years after Shelley's death, when his widow Mary Shelley published it. Shelley argues that poetry is mimetic, that is, it reflects the real world. In the early days of civilization, man imitated natural objects, observing the order and rhythm of these things, and from this impulse was poetry born. Reason and imagination are both important faculties in a poet. Reason, he tells us, is the logical thought, whereas imagination is perceiving things and noticing the similarities between things. Here we might think of the poet's talk and trade, the metaphor and simile which link in one thing to another. It is through reason but also through imagination that we can identify beauty in the world, and from such a perception, a realization are a great civilization made. Poets then are the makers of civilization itself, as Shelley argues. But poets, or those who imagine, express this indestructible order, not only the authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and poetry and painting. They are the institutions of law and the founders of civil society and the inventors of the art of life and the teachers who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true, that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world which is called religion. The poet throughout history has been both legislator, lawmaker, and prophet, religious messenger, and because poets work within the medium of language, unlike the sculptor or painter who works in the visual medium, they have attained a greater degree of fame than other artists. Shelley distinguished between measured and unmeasured language, the former being poetry, which uses meter, that is, you measure out the syllables per line, and the latter being you measure and the latter being prose. Poetry is superior to prose even though both use language, because poetry also taps into the possibilities of sounds. The language of poets have ever affected a certain uniform and harmonious recurrence of sound without which it were not poetry, and which is scarcely less indispensable to the communication of its influence than the words themselves without reference to the particular order. Shelley also makes a distinction between storytelling and indeed history and poetry, arguing a story is of particular facts is as a mirror which obscures and distorts that which should be beautiful. Poetry is a mirror which obscures and distorts that which should be beautiful. Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted. Poetry thus reflects the world like a mirror, but does so in a way that renders the distorted image beautiful. Indeed, poetry can make us see the world in a new light, making it richer and more beautiful. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. It reproduces all that it represents, and the impersonations clothed in its Elysian light stand henceforth in the minds of those who have once contemplated them as memorials of the gentle and exalted content which extends itself over all thoughts and actions with which it coexists. The key to all of this, Shelley retraces his imagination. Shelley devotes the next portion of her defense of poetry to a sort of critical history of poetry from the days of ancient Greece up to the present, considering how, throughout the ages, poets have had a moral influence upon the world. He argues that the fall of Rome and the establishment of Christianity, it was poets who saved the world from ruin and anarchy. The world would have fallen into utter anarchy and darkness, but there were found poets among the authors of the Christian and chivalric systems of manners and religion who created forms of opinion and action never before conceived, which copied into the imaginations of men, became as generals to the bewildered armies of their thoughts. He sees the medieval poets, Dante, as the bridge between ancient and modern world. Responding to Peacock, Shelley argues that the poet's purpose is ut- utilitarian, since poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and has a moral purpose. Where Shelley concludes his essay with the rousing and famous words: "Poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which further casts upon the present the words which express what they understand, not the trumpets which sing the battle and feel not what they inspire. Influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world." Ulysses Curtis. Shelley was not the first great defense of poetry as an art form, and probably the most noticeable precursor in English literature is Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry from the 1580s. But Shelley's argument is more closely keyed into his own time and emphasizes some key aspects of Romanticism as a literary movement and the importance of the poets as a figure in that movement. Shelley's central argument is in our defense of poetry is at the bottom and moral one. Poets enhance our sympathetic imagination, and thus poetry is a force for moral good. That is why in that often quoted final line, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, because poets have both the moral purpose and the imaginative faculties which help to make our world and its moral systems what they are. As Emmett Abrahams observed in his analysis of a defense of poetry in his brilliant The Mirror and the Lamp, Romantic Theory and Critical Tradition, Galaxy Books, Shelley's argument in a defense of poetry is in some ways a Platonic one concerned with eternal forms, but crucially, whereas Plato had written of poets as the rivals of philosophers and statesmen as imitators of the natural world, Shelley collapses this rivalry and argues that great lawmakers and philosophers are poets. Critics have often noticed that a defense of poetry is a great essay on poetry, in spite of what it leaves out. There is no detailed history of the development of poetry. Shelley's whistle stop tour of classical and medieval poets notwithstanding, nor is there any list of rules which good poets should follow. Instead, Shelley's argument in which is one which reflects many of the tenets of the Romantic movement: the idea of poet as a visionary or prophet, the primacy of the imagination, and the ways in which the poets can change the world, becoming lawmakers, statesmen, and philosophers. All says poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the. In the defense of poetry, P.B. Shelley claims that poetry is connote with the origin of man, and man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are driven. Shelley demonstrates the crucial role that language plays in the interpretation of impressions. He believes that the metaphorical power of language marks the before apprehended relations of things and then perpetuate their apprehension until language transforms these relations into words which represents them through images. For portion and classes of thought, Shelley's account of poetic language seeks to find an order to the chaos which possibly Shelley sees in human society, a chaos that only poets can fathom. Therefore, poets enhance poetic language, can reinstitute laws and create new material for for knowledge, determining the role of poets as legislators. In calling poets unacknowledged, Shelley challenges the critic Thomas Love Peacock, who, in the Four Ages of Poetry, believed that the progression of a society caused the deterioration of poetry. Shelley utilizes the defense of poetry to suggest otherwise and to condemn covertly a society that underestimates the importance of poets and their contribution to the progress of society. Therefore, poets are an acknowledged legislator because their role, the progression of society, will not be publicly recognized. आज की वीडियो आपको पसंद है कैसी लगी हमें कमेंट करके बताएं अगर वीडियो अच्छी लगी हो तो लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू माय चैनल मिलते हैं कल एक और इन्फॉर्मेटिव वीडियो के साथ शाम 4 बजे टिल देन कीप वॉचिंग एंड कीप सपोर्टिंग द सोलफुल डायरी थैंक यू